Imagine staring out into the vast, endless expanse of the freezing ocean, knowing that beneath those black, heavy waves lies a secret so terrifying that a multi-billion-dollar corporation spent an absolute fortune just to make sure no one ever asks a single question about it. It was supposed to be a routine voyage, the exact kind of maritime transport that happens thousands of times a day across the globe without ever making a single headline or catching anyone's attention. The cargo vessel, a massive steel behemoth designed specifically to withstand the absolute worst weather the Pacific Ocean could possibly throw at it, left the bustling harbor on a crisp Tuesday morning under skies that were perfectly clear and bright. On board were 14 people, 14 highly experienced sailors, brilliant engineers, and tough deckhands who had spent most of their adult lives navigating treacherous waters across the world. They absolutely weren't rookies who could make a simple mistake. They knew the unpredictable nature of the sea, they knew the strict safety protocols, and they knew exactly how to survive in a crisis. But this particular trip was entirely different from the moment they untied the mooring lines. The families of these 14 crew members waved goodbye from the wooden docks, expecting to hear from their loved ones in just a few days once the ship reached international waters and established a solid satellite contact. But that reassuring phone call never came. Instead, what followed was a deafening, agonizing silence that would eventually spiral into one of the most chilling and heavily guarded cover-ups in modern maritime history. And the strangest thing is that the massive ship didn't just disappear into thin air like some old ghost story. Official radar logs showed the heavy vessel moving at a steady, predictable pace for the first 48 hours, perfectly aligning with their scheduled and approved route. There were absolutely no distress signals, no panicked radio calls to the International Coast Guard, and absolutely no indication whatsoever that anything was going wrong on board. The ocean was completely calm. The regional weather reports were completely benign, and the mechanical diagnostic logs continuously transmitted back to headquarters showed that the ship's massive engines were running at optimal efficiency. Yet, right at the exact stroke of midnight on the third day of the voyage, the ship's global tracking transponder simply stopped working. It wasn't a gradual loss of signal, the kind you might expect if a ship was slowly taking on water and the electrical systems were sparking and failing one by one. It was an instant, surgical blackout. 1 second, the ship was a blinking, reassuring green dot on a digital monitor in a dispatch room thousands of miles away, and the very next second, it was entirely gone. As if a massive, thousands-of-ton steel freighter had been literally erased from reality. When frantic dispatchers tried to hail the experienced captain on the secure emergency frequency, all they got was cold, static dead air. At first, the optimistic company representatives assumed it was just a frustrating technical glitch, perhaps a blown fuse in the communication array that the onboard technician would easily fix in a matter of hours. But as morning broke over the ocean and the radio remained completely, hauntingly silent, a creeping sense of deep dread began to wash over the dispatch room, because giant cargo ships simply do not vanish without leaving a trail of debris, and highly experienced crews do not ever abandon their posts unless something deeply unimaginable and terrifying forces them to. As the agonizing days dragged on with absolutely no word from the 14 missing crew members, the exhausted families waiting back home began to panic entirely. Wives, husbands, and frightened children gathered outside the shipping company's towering glass headquarters, desperately demanding answers that the men in expensive suits simply refused to give. The official corporate statement abruptly released to the hungry press was frustratingly vague, smoothly claiming that they had unfortunately lost contact due to a severe, highly localized weather anomaly, and that extensive search and rescue operations were already well underway. But there's a huge problem with that convenient story. Independent meteorologists immediately checked the satellite weather data for that specific sector of the open ocean during the exact time the digital signal was lost, and they found absolutely nothing. No rogue waves, no sudden violent typhoons, not even a heavy passing rainstorm. The sea out there was as flat and calm as a pane of glass. So what exactly was the massive corporation searching for? Here is where things start to take a very dark and twisted turn. Instead of actively cooperating with the International Coast Guard and military search planes that generously offered to scan the vast grid, the shipping company did something highly unusual and deeply suspicious. They quietly hired a private, heavily armed maritime security firm to conduct the search operation entirely off the official books. They essentially locked the official government authorities out of the primary search zone, loudly citing obscure international maritime laws and aggressively claiming that the cargo currently on board was highly sensitive corporate intellectual property that strictly required specialized handling. This wasn't just a standard, hopeful rescue mission anymore. To any seasoned observer, it looked exactly like a ruthless containment operation. The heartbroken families were left entirely in the dark, receiving only cold, automated email updates that said absolutely nothing of value about their missing loved ones. Behind tightly closed doors, brave whistleblowers would later claim that the top company executives were absolutely panicking, not because they had tragically lost 14 loyal employees, but because of what those innocent employees might have accidentally seen, or what might have somehow broken loose in the restricted lower decks. You see, the detailed cargo manifest for that specific voyage was deeply classified and completely hidden from public view. The forged official documents claimed they were simply transporting standard, boring industrial machinery parts, but frightened dock workers who originally loaded the ship under the cover of darkness reported seeing dozens of completely unmarked, heavily reinforced steel crates being violently brought aboard, escorted by silent men who definitely did not work for the local port authority. Whatever was securely hidden inside those mysterious crates was unbelievably heavy, strictly required an immense amount of electrical power to keep constantly refrigerated, and was deliberately loaded into a dark section of the ship that the regular crew was strictly forbidden from ever entering. The veteran captain was the only person on board with the heavy keys to that lower deck. So, as the private armed security team aggressively scoured the silent rolling ocean, they weren't just looking for cold survivors desperately holding on to bright orange lifeboats. They were desperately hunting for their secret, highly illegal cargo before anyone else could stumble upon it and expose the truth. And the absolute worst part is, the 14 hard-working people on board were probably considered nothing more than acceptable collateral damage in a high-stakes corporate gamble that went horribly, terribly wrong. Exactly 9 days after the initial baffling disappearance, a massive breakthrough happened that would only serve to deepen the terrifying mystery even further. A private, low-flying search plane finally spotted the massive vessel. It was drifting aimlessly about 300 miles, completely off its original planned course, bobbing silently and heavily in the cold gray waters of the Pacific. From the air, the massive steel ship looked entirely intact and completely undamaged. The thick hull absolutely wasn't breached. There were zero signs of an onboard fire, and the massive shipping containers on the top deck were perfectly secured and untouched. It looked exactly like a modern-day ghost ship. When the heavily armed, highly paid security team finally boarded the drifting vessel, aggressively dropping down from black helicopters onto the rusted metal deck, what they found inside those quiet corridors was enough to make even hardened, fearless mercenaries freeze entirely in their tracks. The massive ship was completely abandoned, but it wasn't just completely empty. It was as if the 14 crew members had literally evaporated right in the middle of their mundane daily routines. Down in the galley, half-eaten hot meals were left sitting on the tables, and the black coffee in the metal pots had long since turned into cold, bitter sludge. Deep in the dark engine room, the massive, deafening diesel engines had apparently run smoothly until they simply, quietly ran out of fuel, suggesting that nobody had been down there to quickly shut them off or manually switch the reserve tanks. But here is the specific, chilling detail that will keep you awake at night. The emergency lifeboats were still securely, tightly fastened to the sides of the massive ship. All the inflatable emergency rafts were exactly where they were supposed to be, completely untouched in their hard plastic casings. The thick survival suits, the bright flare guns, the high-calorie emergency rations, absolutely none of it was missing. The experienced crew had frantically abandoned ship because of some catastrophic, immediate emergency. They somehow didn't take a single piece of standard survival gear with them into the freezing water. They just completely vanished without a trace. And then, the tense security team slowly reached the captain's bridge. The heavy steel door had been desperately barricaded from the inside. Somebody had violently piled heavy metal chairs, thick wooden desks, and heavy filing cabinets directly against the door, desperately trying to keep something horrifying out. When the armed team finally forced their way inside, pushing the heavy debris aside, they found the ship's expensive communication equipment completely and utterly smashed to pieces. It obviously wasn't an accident or a random technical failure. Somebody had purposely taken a heavy red fire axe from the wall and violently, repeatedly destroyed the entire radio console, ensuring that absolutely no outgoing signals could possibly be sent out to the world. The ship's official daily logbook, a massive, heavy-bound ledger that dedicated captains guard with their actual lives, was lying wide open on the scratched navigation table. The very last entry was written in frantic, shaking, almost illegible handwriting. It didn't mention a sudden storm, and it definitely didn't mention a mechanical failure. It only contained a few terrifying, cryptic words slashed across the page. "They are awake. The lower hatch is open. May God forgive us." The shocked private security team was immediately and forcefully ordered by their corporate bosses over the satellite radio to aggressively confiscate the logbook, completely scrub the entire bridge of any lingering fingerprints, and absolutely not, under any circumstances, go down into those dark, forbidden lower cargo decks. Within a mere 24 hours of the ghost ship's quiet discovery, the massive corporate cover-up machine ruthlessly shifted into maximum overdrive. Before the grieving families were even officially notified that the missing ship had actually been found, a ruthless team of high-powered, incredibly expensive corporate lawyers and aggressive crisis management fixers suddenly descended on their quiet suburban homes. These absolutely weren't your average friendly legal representatives. These were the specific kind of icy suits who silently handled billion-dollar oil spills and catastrophic, deadly industrial disasters. They arrived in sleek black cars, carrying thick leather briefcases full of complicated documents that would rapidly change the vulnerable families' lives forever, but at a truly horrific, unspoken cost. The cold lawyers sat down in cozy living rooms and warm kitchens, looked grieving widows and weeping parents directly in the eye, and slid massive, intimidating stacks of legal paper across the table. It was officially a settlement offer, but this wasn't just any standard, quiet settlement. The panicking company was offering an absolutely unprecedented, life-altering sum of money. We are talking tens of millions of dollars for each individual family, but it came firmly attached with the most aggressively restrictive, ironclad non-disclosure agreement ever drafted in modern legal history. The strict terms were absolutely draconian and terrifying. If the desperate families accepted the massive payout, they could absolutely never ever speak about the disappearance in public. They could never give emotional interviews to the hungry press. They could never secretly hire private investigators to look into the matter. And they could never, ever sue the massive company for wrongful death. They were strictly forbidden from even casually mentioning the name of the doomed ship on any social media platform. If they ever broke any of these aggressive rules, the ruthless company would not only take all the money back instantly, but they would maliciously sue the grieving families into absolute unrecoverable bankruptcy. The smooth lawyers coldly framed it as an act of immense, unprecedented corporate generosity, a compassionate way to ensure the broken families were perfectly taken care of after a tragic, completely unexplainable accident at sea. But deeply grieving people are absolutely not stupid. They instantly knew that giant, greedy companies do not just happily hand over hundreds of millions of dollars out of the sheer goodness of their hearts. You absolutely don't enthusiastically pay that kind of astronomical, jaw-dropping hush money, unless the hidden truth is so legally devastating, so completely catastrophic, that it could entirely destroy the massive corporation and quickly send its top executives to a dark federal prison for the rest of their miserable lives. Despite their desperate, burning desire for actual answers, almost every single vulnerable family slowly signed the papers. When you are suddenly staring at a completely uncertain, terrifying future, with heavy mortgages to aggressively pay and young children to somehow feed, the sheer crushing pressure of a massive corporation aggressively waving a golden, Multi-million-dollar ticket right in front of you is essentially impossible to resist. They painfully took the money, and they heavily took the silence. The relieved company officially and publicly declared the 14 brave crew members tragically lost at sea due to a freak maritime accident, quickly filed the massive insurance paperwork, and quietly, swiftly scrapped the enormous cargo ship in a highly secure, private, heavily guarded salvage yard where no independent, curious inspector could ever safely examine the hull. They literally and completely buried the only evidence. But secrets that massive and that dark have a funny way of slowly leaking out, no matter how much dirty money you frantically throw at them to stay safely buried. Years after the official fake investigation was quietly closed and the heavy files were permanently sealed, dark rumors began to softly circulate in the shady, hidden corners of the global maritime shipping industry. A guilt-ridden retired executive, who had intimately been part of the ruthless crisis team, but was forcefully pushed out of the company shortly after the messy incident, anonymously leaked a few heavily redacted, terrifying documents to an aggressive independent investigative journalist. These shocking documents painted a truly terrifying, nightmare-inducing picture of exactly what was hidden inside those unmarked, heavily reinforced steel crates in the dark lower deck. According to the explosive leak, the greedy shipping company had secretly and illegally partnered with a deeply unethical, off-the-books, shadow biological research firm. They were highly illegally transporting a completely volatile, entirely unregulated organic compound, essentially a highly classified experimental bioweapon or an aggressively mutating pathogen that was entirely illegal to ever move through international airspace or official inspected commercial ports. The heavy, roaring refrigeration units absolutely weren't keeping boring engine parts cool. They were desperately keeping something biological and deeply terrifying in a fragile state of deep frozen suspension. The horrifying theory is that sometime during the quiet third day of the doomed voyage, the aging refrigeration systems in that forbidden, dark lower deck suffered a sudden, catastrophic mechanical failure. Whatever was unnaturally sleeping in those heavy crates violently woke up, or whatever highly toxic chemical was contained inside began to aggressively, silently leak into the ship's main ventilation system. That completely explains the frantic, desperate barricade on the bridge. The terrified crew wasn't trying to keep a physical monster out. They were frantically trying to completely seal themselves off from a highly toxic, mind-altering biological agent that was rapidly, silently flooding the entire ship. The violently smashed radio. Perhaps a deeply infected, terrified crew member, driven completely and utterly insane by the aggressive neurotoxin, destroyed the only lifeline they had before the rest of the doomed crew violently succumbed to the deadly exposure. When the private, heavily armed security team finally found the drifting ship, the panicking corporate bosses ordered them to completely seal the lower decks because they knew exactly what kind of biological, apocalyptic nightmare was patiently waiting down there. The 14 brave crew members didn't magically evaporate. Their bodies were likely completely dissolved or severely, horribly mutated by the highly aggressive pathogen hidden away in the dark, toxic bowels of the ship that was quietly towed away and completely incinerated in a private, fiery salvage yard. The silenced families are now living in enormous, quiet mansions, driving fast luxury cars, and sending their kids to the most expensive elite schools in the world, all completely funded by dark blood money. They sit in heavy silence, tightly bound by terrifying legal threats, forever wondering exactly what their loved ones endured in those final, completely terrifying hours in the middle of the cold, unforgiving ocean. And it leaves you deeply wondering, if a powerful corporation can flawlessly make an enormous cargo ship and 14 human beings completely vanish from human history with just a few quick signatures and a big enough check, what exactly else are they secretly transporting right now, at this very second, on a massive, silent ship sailing just miles off your coast?